In 2026, reading has never been easier. A swipe replaces a page turn. A screen remembers where you stopped. A device adjusts the light, the font, even the pace, so you never have to struggle. But here's the question no one seems to be asking. What happens when reading stops asking anything of us? Because a physical book has weight. It resists you. It smells like paper and time and other people's hands. It doesn't adapt to your mood. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't care if you're tired. And a screen, however elegant, remains lifeless by design. So this episode isn't about nostalgia versus progress. It's not about being anti-technology. It's about something quieter. When reading becomes seamless, what happens to the part of us that learned to sit still, to imagine, to endure silence, to meet a story on its own terms? Stories after Hollywood gets Hollywood. Fun romantasy, and that's exactly you. This Sunday at... Hello and welcome back to Between the Covers with Danielle. If you're new here, I'm Danielle Robinson. This is Oscar. And this is a space for thoughtful conversations about reading, culture, and the way stories shape us long after we close the book or turn off the screen. Today's episode is a little different. There are no book reviews, no recommendations, no 5 novels you need to read right now. Instead, we're stepping back to look at reading itself as an experience, a practice, and increasingly a designed interaction. Because in 2026, reading isn't just about text anymore. It's about interfaces, about optimization, about immersion that promises to make everything easier, faster, smoother. So today we're asking a more uncomfortable question. Are we gaining something profound through digital reading? Or are we quietly unlearning the skills that reading once required of us? This isn't a debate. It's not physical versus digital. It's an examination of what kind of readers and thinkers we're becoming. Let's begin. For most of human history, reading was never just an intellectual exercise. It was embodied. You felt a book before you understood it. The weight in your hands, the stiffness of a new spine, the loosening of pages as the story progressed. You learned physically where you were in a narrative, halfway through, nearing the end, lingering in a chapter that refused to move quickly. A physical book teaches you patience without announcing that lesson. It doesn't adapt to your comfort. It doesn't adjust the lighting because you're tired. It doesn't summarize what you missed when your attention drifted. Instead, it asks something quietly demanding: stay. When reading requires effort, interpretation deepens. When progress is automated, meaning accumulates more slowly and more securely. This isn't nostalgia. This is about friction. And friction, in cognitive terms, isn't a flaw. It's often the very thing that allows thought to form. So when we remove that friction, when reading becomes seamless, responsive, adaptive, we need to ask what else is being quietly removed with it. And that brings us to the promise and the seduction of digital reading. Digital reading didn't rise because it was soulless. It rose because it was seductive. It promised relief. Relief from eye strain, relief from slow passages, relief from confusion, fatigue, and silence. In 2026, digital reading is no longer just about portability. It's about responsiveness, text that adapts to your pace, interfaces that adjust to your mood, narration that fills the quiet when attention starts to wander. And on the surface, this feels generous. But there's a subtle shift happening here, one we rarely name. When reading becomes adaptive, interpretation becomes assisted. A physical book doesn't check in on you. A digital interface does. It highlights what it thinks matters. It reminds you what you forgot. It smooths over ambiguity in the name of engagement. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the reader moves from participant to recipient. There's nothing inherently wrong with convenience, but convenience always has a cost. When friction disappears, endurance weakens. When silence is filled automatically, imagination has less room to operate. When stories begin to meet us exactly where we are, we stop being required to meet them halfway. And that matters because some of the most transformative reading experiences aren't comfortable ones. They demand rereading. They demand confusion. They demand sitting with uncertainty longer than feels efficient. When a story adapts to you, you no longer have to adapt to the story. And that changes the relationship entirely. Which is why the real question isn't whether digital reading is better or worse. It's whether we've misunderstood what reading was ever meant to optimize. Because the problem isn't the screen, it's the assumption that effort is something reading should eliminate. At this point, conversations about reading usually collapse into a familiar argument. Physical versus digital, tradition versus progress, nostalgia versus innovation. But that binary is a distraction because most people in 2026 aren't choosing one or the other. They move fluidly between formats, often within the same week, the same day. The real shift isn't what we're reading on. It's what reading is being asked to do. We've quietly reframed reading as a problem to be solved. Too slow? Optimize it. Too demanding? Assist it. Too silent? Fill it. And once reading becomes something that must constantly accommodate us, its capacity to challenge us begins to erode. This isn't about rejecting technology. Digital tools have expanded access in ways that matter deeply. They've brought reading to people who were previously excluded. They've removed barriers that should never have existed. That matters, full stop. But access and depth aren't the same thing. And ease isn't the same as meaning. When every reading experience is engineered to reduce friction, we lose something that doesn't announce its absence until much later: the ability to stay with complexity without assistance. The danger isn't that screens are replacing books. The danger is that frictionless consumption is replacing reading as a practice. Because reading was never meant to be efficient. It was meant to be absorbing, sometimes difficult, sometimes slow, sometimes resistant to us entirely. So the question we're left with isn't which format is superior, it's this: what kind of attention are we training ourselves to tolerate? And what happens when we no longer practice the kind that requires effort? Reading has always been more than the transfer of information. It's been one of the few places where we practiced stillness, where we learned to sit inside someone else's mind without interruption, where meaning emerged slowly, sometimes only after discomfort. And that hasn't changed because of technology. What has changed is our tolerance for resistance. In a world increasingly designed to meet us exactly where we are, the act of reading once asked us to move, to stretch our attention, to endure silence, to stay when it would have been easier to leave. A physical book doesn't chase you. It doesn't adapt to your emotional state. It doesn't reward speed. It simply waits. And waiting, it turns out, isn't a passive act. It's a discipline. This isn't about choosing sides. Digital reading isn't the enemy. Physical books aren't sacred relics. But if we allow reading to become only another frictionless experience, another optimized interaction, we risk losing one of the last places where effort and imagination quietly meet. So perhaps the question isn't whether digital can replace physical. Perhaps the question is simpler and harder. What kind of reader do you want to be in a world that no longer requires you to slow down? If you stayed with me to the end, thank you. If this conversation resonated, if it made you pause or rethink the way you read, I'd love for you to stay connected. You can subscribe here on YouTube for weekly essays like this one, where we explore reading, culture, and the ideas that shape how we live with stories. You'll also find me on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, where these conversations continue in long form, along with book reviews and regular reading inspiration, where we meet quietly, thoughtfully, and without rushing. And if you'd like to follow along day to day, you can find me across social media, where I share reflections, behind the scenes reading moments, and ongoing conversations with this community. All the links are below. Next Sunday, we're stepping into the worlds we were warned about. From 1984 to Brave New World and Children of Men, we'll be asking whether dystopian fiction was ever really about the future, or whether it's quietly become a blueprint for the present. So if you're interested in what stories do to us, not just what they say, I'll see you next week.